is just so amazing how God worked in this story. But it's been 5 years, and now this is a continuation of the series that David's been doing on how to hear the voice of God and how God personally led us here to Washington.
Yes. So some of you have been here for the first few messages that we've talked about how to hear the voice of God. The last two that we had talked about was how to hear the voice of God through providence, because there are ways in which God will line up circumstances in our lives that we cannot just attribute to chance. The last one we talked about is with dreams, and each one has progressively gotten to a topic. It gets closer and closer to the primary ways I believe God speaks to us. So this message actually brings together both of those things because, as I had mentioned last time, if you believe that God has spoken to you in some kind of dream or something like that, you want to do everything you can to make sure that you're not just talking to yourself. Everybody follow that? Because that can get really, really dangerous to sit here and think that everything that felt like a strong impression must have been the voice of God. And so today we're going to be looking at our personal experience with this that I pray will be a blessing to you. So perhaps before we get into the rest of the word for today, we can have just one more word of prayer before we start. Our Father in heaven, we want to thank you so much for bringing us here, Lord, and bringing everyone here to fellowship and worship with us. And I pray, Lord, the word spoken would not be ours, but would be yours. Help us to be able to speak, Lord, in a timely fashion, but also in a way that speaks to every individual here, for you desire everyone to hear your voice. Help us not to harden our hearts, Lord, but to receive the blessings you promise. Ask in the name of Jesus. Amen.
Amen. So when we gave our testimony here several years ago, we had mentioned that we had a really powerful story of how God led us here. Right after David and I were married, we moved to Reno, Nevada. And David had a circuit of different churches that he was preaching at each month. But we felt I felt limited in what we were able to do. So after we had our first child, I began praying for 3 different things. That God would open the door for ministry. Let's see this. Can you make that work?
Yeah.
That God would open the door for ministry, and that he would help us to have a country home, and third, a good school for Josiah. And after 8 years, I researched every possible option out there. And I mean like far, like the Philippines, like the Middle East. I was looking for where God was possibly calling us. But inevitably, every single door would shut along the way. And so what I did, I felt like I was going to burst with frustration because I was like, God, I know you're calling us to something else. But David didn't share the same sense of adventure that I had. So I began to pray that God would show David what to do. But God answered in a way that neither one of us were expecting.
All right, so this is where things kind of shifted from the everyday mundane to maybe something that could be a little more than ordinary. Now, I'm somebody that's a little bit of a lucid dreamer. Now, I don't know if anybody knows what that means to be a lucid dreamer, but I am aware when I am asleep. And I am aware even when I'm dreaming. And so every once in a while, if I'm really, really aware, I can mess around with my dreams and kind of make whatever I want happen. That's really difficult to do, but that happens. So in either case, I remember there was one time where I had a dream, and it's not anything like Martin Luther King's dream. It was something quite different. And when I had this dream, I remember there being some certain details that really stood out to me. Now, I remember a couple of things, which you can see up here on the picture. I remember leaving from Reno. I knew we were going to move somewhere. I remember loading things into a red hatchback car. And then I also remember that from there, when I looked up, it looked like the hills were like kind of smoky and like looking like that was a fire, which wasn't too unusual in Reno. Now, the thing that struck me as strange is that even though my thought was, okay, we're probably going to move up toward Washington, it seemed like we were going the wrong way to get there. And so I woke up from that, didn't think too much of it, jotted down a few details, but just kind of thought, probably nothing. But based on that, I figured it would probably be a good idea that maybe for our next vacation, we would travel up to Washington just to kind of see what's going on. Maybe there's a school, maybe there's some reason that the Lord would lead us out in this direction.
This was all I needed to hear. I started researching everything in Washington. I was ready to go. Somebody had suggested that I contact Mission Creek. So I called Mary Nell Ellingson. And it happened that was her first time in 20 years where she was going to be available during the same dates that we would. Normally, they would be on a mission trip to Peru, but her son had passed away recently. So she said, no, go ahead, come on up. I'm like, you sure? And she said, yeah, come up, I'll show you the place. And so we decided, okay, we'll go. And we recently had some friends from Reno, Chris and Shannon Vega, who are actually here today. We decided we'll stop by and we'll visit with them as well. And it was a nice trip, but we thought, okay, sometime in the future. We didn't feel any specific draw or, God saying, yes, this is the path. But, something we tucked away in the back of our mind.
All right. So after all these things had happened, I remember I was driving home, and this was probably like 9 months or so later. But I remember driving home, and as I was driving home, I remember looking up, and sure enough, the hills were like smoking. I was like, oh, that's interesting. And then I was just, now the thought I should have had was like, oh, Lord, what's going to happen next? But it was more like, oh, Lord, what's going on now? Because I just immediately had that sense of dread that something was going to happen, but I was not going to like the way that it happened. And so I remember walking over to the mailbox and checking the mail, which was my normal routine when I got home. And this time when I checked the mail, I find a letter. And that letter contained something. Now, just as a side note, in that last picture that you saw where the hills were smoking, this is an actual picture of whatever actually have seen because we lived in this area. And it turned out that these hills were on fire, not from just any old cause, like where someone struck a match, but they caught on fire from sparks from a moving truck. And I was like, oh, okay, all right, well, I don't know if that's providential. Incidentally, we didn't know that that was why that fire had started. Like so many other things, when God shows you something, his providence does not just stop in that moment. You can continuously find confirmations for what God has been showing you. So even when we look back, we keep finding more and more details confirming it and not the other way around. So in either case, when I got home, I found a letter, and that letter was from the Nevada, from the court in Las Vegas. Now, I do not have a good history with Vegas. Vegas was the place where my parents had split up. It was a place where one of my parents was hospitalized twice. It is the same place where, like, almost every time our family has gone out there, something not good in the Jones family has occurred. So I wasn't excited about Vegas for reasons even beyond the other reasons why most of you all maybe or maybe not are excited about Vegas. And so when this came, it became clear to me that I was like, all right, Lord, if I'm going to apply for a job in a place that I do not want to live, I need more than just a possible dream-ish situation. If you're going to lead me, I want you to be able to lead me like you led Abraham. Now, you all know that when Abraham left, he left not knowing where he was going. This is what it says in Hebrews chapter 11, verses 8 through 11. It says, by faith, when Abraham was called, he left, like he forsook, not knowing where he went. And I said, all right, Lord, if you want me to go somewhere, and I don't know why and where I'm going exactly, then I need some sign from you that I'm actually on the right track. And so I prayed a couple of things. Make it as clear to me as it was to Abraham, and I will certainly go wherever you send me. And the second thing I prayed was, make it as clear to me as it was when Jennifer and I were going to get married. Because when her and I got married, we had a host of things that happened, one of which you may want to bookmark this, is that we had to pack and move our stuff 6 times. And so I wasn't asking for that. But God has a sense of humor, and we'll find out more about that as we continue on. All right, so in this next one, we were trying to figure out, okay, they wanted me to come in for a job interview. They received my application, so they wanted me to drive down to Vegas, just an 8 or 9 hour drive, just right around the corner. And so I said, all right, well, if we're going to go, we need to rent a car. I don't want to put all these miles on our vehicle, so we'll rent something. And just so happened that during this time, there's an event called Burning Man. Anybody ever heard of Burning Man? Yes, all right. So this was going on during that time, and car rental prices skyrocket during this time. And some of the reason is because when you drive out into Black Rock Desert, there's all this playa sand out there. And that playa will get all over the vehicle, and it's incredibly hard to wash. In fact, we've done this one time where you actually have to use like vinegar and water just to get the stuff off of the vehicle. And so the insurance rates were through the roof. And I was like, all right, perfect. This interview is going to be way too expensive for us to rent a car and a hotel and all this other stuff just to go to a job interview that I don't want to go to anyway. So we're not going to go. And then I went through and checked my email, and then guess what shows up? A nice little coupon from rental.com. They wanted to make sure that I would rent a car from them, and I was not happy about this. And I was like, well, maybe it'll still be too expensive. And it wasn't too expensive. In fact, if you go to that next slide here, when we rented the car, there was only like 1 car left that matched the description for what we wanted. And it was not $200 a day. As you can see there on the receipt, I believe it was, what was it, $13?
It was $13.
$13 a day. Instead of
normally
220.
200.
Yes. And so then when we got there to find our $13 a day car, guess what kind of car it was? It was a red hatchback. Now, I'm not happy about this at this point, but I'm willing to do whatever God says because he's answering at least the most important part of my prayer, which is like, if I'm going to do something that you ask me to do, I want to make sure that it's actually you talking. So far, so good and bad at the same time, but God was listening.
So we packed everything up. We started going. We made a trip out of it. As the boys very excited for pools and for, all the fun things that we would have down there. Additionally, we went and visited a few different sites. Let's see if it's not advancing.
Okay.
We saw a few different sites.
Yes, and as you can see, the boys are very creative. Goggles for underwater, but they decided that'd be just as much
Keep the
fun.
bugs.
Yeah, to keep the bugs out of your eyes. So next time you stick your
So-
head out the window.
We went and visited things, the Hoover Dam. This is a monstrous skate park. And the boys asked that we fit in a picture of a Lamborghini that we took a picture of.
Yes.
These were the memorable moments for the kids.
Yes, that was probably all the sign they needed that they should move to Las Vegas was they have Lamborghinis, we're down.
So we really didn't want to go to Vegas, but we decided, make the best out of it. So we rented a spacious hotel that looked like an apartment. It had a couple of pools and was away from the main strip. But when we got there, we discovered that this non-refundable reservation, why it looked like an apartment is because it was also low-income housing. So we thought, okay, it's just one night. We'll try to enjoy it. We go down to the pool, and God had two surprises for us. First was when we got down to the pool, there was this cockroach next to the pool, and it was spinning in circles. And I'm like, David, the bugs are on drugs. I was like, I don't want to go to Vegas. But second is we met a family down there, and we started to be able to talk to them about spiritual things. We're like, okay, this is why God sent us. We were just going to come here, minister to this family, point them in the right direction, and then we're done. God doesn't really want us in Vegas.
Yes.
But we have more surprises. And this is a picture of the boys swimming at that same pool. And this is another place that we visited.
So this picture here is actually a picture of the place where I did my interview. So the position was as a specialty court specialist, where essentially as a mental health therapist, I would be assessing people who had been arrested and had been incarcerated for crimes. And the specialty court specialists, their whole purpose was making sure that these folks receive rehabilitative services and made sure that they were qualified for it. So they had to have both a diagnosis with substance abuse as well as a psychotic disorder. So anyway, lots of fun doing that. So that was the place that we went to for this interview. And when we were there, I was tempted to tank the interview. Like, I really thought about going in there. It's like, all right, God, well, I've gone as far as you've asked me to go. We witnessed a few people out here. Now I could just do the pseudo interview and then move on. But that didn't feel right because my thought was, well, if this is God's will, whether I do well in this interview or not, I'm not going to be the one that decides this. I'm going to let God decide. So I did my best with the interview. I talked to them about all these things that I wanted to do. They told me about rate of pay and all this other stuff that was going to come along with the position. I was working as a director of a mental health clinic in Reno already, and so whatever rate of pay they had was probably not going to be quite as much. I didn't really care about that, but I just asked at the end, it's like, well, is there any possibility that you would be able to offer a salary that's comparable to what I'm doing now? And they said, well, in order to do that, you'd actually have to get all the way up toward the top because this has to do with the state and city budget. So trying to get a raise is not so easy when you're working for the state or the city or the county. And so I was like, great. And so then after that, I prayed. It's like, all right, so Lord, here's a salary that I want. And if they don't offer that to me, then I'm not taking this job. I thought I was being slick. God knows better than I do. And so after all this, after the interview had been completed, the next thing that happened was about 48 hours after the interview, they actually called me to offer me the position. And I was like, oh, okay. I remember my heart was kind of pounding, and they said, hey, and we were able to try to ask for an additional amount. Now, as a side note between these two things is during that 48 hours, I prayed about a specific amount that I wanted them to try to offer. It was an exact percentage based on my actual salary, which wasn't going to be a whole lot more. I really didn't care about the amount. It was just I needed God to match numbers for me, so I knew that what I was doing was what I was supposed to be doing. And so I asked for that, but in my heart, I said, well, if they even get close to it, I'll just settle. So they called, and they got close to it, and I was like, all right, here we go. And so I said, okay, just give me a little bit. I'm going to try to call back. There's a lot of uprooting and moving I'd have to do before I accept the position. I waited about 2 hours, and they called back 2 hours later, thinking that perhaps the reason I had to think about it is because the money wasn't enough. And then they offered the exact amount that I prayed about and told no one about other than just God. So here we go to Vegas. So a pastor friend of ours also encouraged us to pray. I believe that when you are trying to find out what God's will is, you want to follow the counsel that God has given. In Proverbs chapter 15 and verse 22, it says, without counsel, purposes are disappointed, but in the multitude of counselors, they are established. And so even with all these signs falling into place, I still knew it was right to pray with someone else who understood these kinds of things. And so we prayed about it, and he said, look, I was reading today in Ministry of Healing about this particular statement that says, if God has sent us to Joppa, it won't do us any, or if God has sent us to Nineveh, it won't do us any good to go to Joppa. And anybody who's familiar with Jonah's story, you understand this. If God tells you to go one place, he is not asking you to go to plan B. You need to go and do what God tells you to do. And so that's what he shared with me, hoping he would talk me out of it. He certainly did not. So following this, there's some other things that happened as well.
So we conceded, and we're like, okay, maybe this is what God wants us to do. So I posted something on Facebook telling everybody all these really strange details of what was going on.
And that whole list, by the way, were all the signs that Jennifer had posted on her Facebook post. These are all the things that happened providentially, and she just listed them all out. Now, we hadn't left yet, but this is how many signs had already occurred before we made the decision to leave.
And there were far more that I couldn't even fit. But,
So the day had finally come around where I needed to call my boss and say, hey, I might be leaving and taking another job, which was going to be a big deal because, a lot had happened at the company that I was working at, and my leaving was probably going to not be a positive impact on them. So I was like saying, all right, God, so if he tries to talk me out of taking this job, that means I don't have to go. And so I called him and I said, hey, so-and-so, I'm thinking I might end up having to take a job somewhere else. And he's like, oh, great. All right, fine, man. Like, what is it? Where are you going? And I said, well, I might be going to Las Vegas, but I don't know if that's where. And before I could finish my sentence, he's like, God is sending you there. Now, he's not a Christian. At no point has he ever professed faith in anything at any time. But in that particular moment, he believed that God was sending me there. Now, he didn't tell me why, but he said there was something going on in Las Vegas that indicated to him that God might be trying to send us there. Later on, I went to go talk with one of my supervisors, also hoping they would talk me out of it. But she said the same thing. It's like, wow, I know I don't really believe it much, but I can kind of see why God would send you there. And I didn't know what she was talking about until I looked at the TV and found out about what you all probably found out about as well. And that was that Mandalay Bay shooting, like during that country concert where somebody up in a window shot at over 50 or 75 people. I can't remember now how many, and many people had lost their lives that day. And so my boss and my supervisor did not try to talk me out of it because it seemed like this providential thing that God would send me down there after something like this had occurred. And so no such luck. By the way, I don't think God allowed people to get shot just to make a dream of mine come true or a nightmare of mine come true. But God has ways of lining things up because he knows the end from the beginning, and he knows the things that we need to hear and see to know that he's leading us.
So this was a turning point. This happened on October 1st, but no sooner had we made this decision and started pulling up roots, then we had some serious confusion set in. One was the reality. Once we accepted the reality of the move, skepticism turned into complete confusion. On October 5th, we discovered the non-miraculous origin of the letter.
Right. So at this point, I was trying to figure out how the letter even got to me because the last time I applied for any jobs in Vegas would have been like almost 7 years prior to when I received the note. But what actually ended up happening is I talked to some therapist friends of mine as I was trying to prepare for this transition, and I told them about the letter I received. They're like, oh, that letter. Yeah, like all of us received this letter because it went out to every licensed therapist in Nevada. And it's like...
And previously, we didn't know how they got our address.
Correct. Right. And so now it was like, okay, did I just get scammed into going down somewhere? And am I just chasing after signs? So this really set in our confusion even more.
And even further, around this time, we had 2 different churches contact us and say, hey, we need some full-time help. And we're like, this is the reason why. God wanted us to start uprooting. There was a church where they needed an associate pastor. So we met with the pastor, what date was that? On October 22. But we were also contacted by the Heavenly Seventh-day Adventist Church in Tahoe. They needed help as well. So with the Heavenly Church, they even went to the conference. They started talking to everyone. They said, hey, we need you to put in a resume. And so we thought, okay, this must be why.
Yes. And anybody who recognizes that date, October 22, what happened on October 22, everyone? The great disappointment. So you can anticipate what happened with us because we thought, oh, surely God will just keep us here so then we could just minister at a church and not have to go to Las Vegas.
So we wanted to back out of the move, but something still didn't feel right about backing out. On October 21, David spoke at a prayer meeting in Galt, California. Afterward, we spoke with a gentleman that had invited us, and he was telling us about his father. His father was just an average church member, and he said his dad felt called to move to Washington to minister. So what his dad did, and we're listening very carefully because he didn't know the surroundings behind what we were going through. He didn't know the story. So we listened very closely, and we asked, "Oh, what did he do?" And he said he took some pieces of paper. He wrote down all the churches in Washington, and he threw them in a hat, and he picked one out. And that one moment changed the rest of his life. But I think we were kind of like, that I don't know about that one. But I think David was so blindsided by the simplicity and the non-miraculous nature of the method that we hardly heard what else was being said. So we thought, should we try this? Is this God telling us something? Because, we're kind of desperate right now. We just want to know what God wants us to do.
Yeah, and
But David was not content with the method's probability ratios.
yes, so because I thought, look, if you put a bunch of stuff into a hat, the chances of drawing something is 100%. But that doesn't guarantee that place that you drew is where God wanted you to go. So once you've put all these things into a hat, you've guaranteed that you have to go somewhere. And so I thought that is not going to do it. Like if you're gonna cast lots, you better make this thing count. And so
So after the potluck, we drove to the Consumnes River Wildlife Preserve to take a walk. And it was there that we decided, okay, we'll cast lots.
yes.
So David mentioned a little bit about the problem with the system. So we decided on 7 destinations that we were going to put in this hat. And it included Las Vegas, staying in Reno, Olympia. But as David had mentioned, if you draw, you're going to get 1 out of 7 no matter what you do. So you want to go through this?
So ever the wanting to calculate and make sure that something was statistically unlikely, if we were going to draw something, what I said is like, look, we're going to put 7 things in there and everybody's got to draw. And everybody has to draw independently and nobody can know what the other person drew. Every time you draw, you put it back into the hat and then you shake it up to make sure that there isn't some misshapen piece of paper that keeps landing on the top. And so we were going to do this thing right, because for one person to get it, that's a 1 out of 7 chance. For 2 people is 1 out of 49, and for 3 is 1 out of 343. And for all of us to draw the exact same thing was 1 out of 2,401. So that seemed highly unlikely, and I liked that. And so I was thinking, okay, if we can do that, that'd be good. And so each person began to draw. And so Jennifer was shaking up the hat, but she had to also be a blind observer. And so I think it was Josiah that drew first. And then I heard her make a little expression like, And I'm like, that means he drew Las Vegas. I could just feel it. I wasn't going to look. And then the second one draws. She's like, Judah draws. And it's like, And I hear these noises. And then Jennifer draws. She's like, And I'm like, okay, I know what's going on here. And so I reached in there and I grabbed something. And I was like, I almost know that this is Las Vegas. So I put it back. And I said, Lord, if this is you, then you can get this even if I mix it up. So I shuffled it back around and then drew back in there again and pulled it out. And lo and behold, it said Olympia. And I was like, that's confusing. Now, 1 out of 343 is still not, that's really improbable. But it wasn't improbable enough for me to be totally certain. And so I had to continuously stay in this place of uncertainty. So after all this, I was like, well, God, I think that's enough. I think I should just pull out of this thing. Then I read part of my devotions there. When we had actually pulled over, I decided that I wanted to actually just find out what God might be saying. Go to the next one.
Yeah. Because David was so frustrated with the ambiguity, he was just like, never mind. And then?
So then I read this, and this is actually from my phone. On my phone during this entire time, I read through one particular devotional for that year, and that was Conflict and Courage. And throughout that devotional, whenever I saw something that stood out to me, I highlighted it. So these highlights that you see on here are exactly what's in my app, like right now, because I highlighted it. And you go back, check the dates when all this stuff happened, and so that's how I continue to know. But here's the quote that's listed there.
The title.
So this is from Conflict and Courage, and the name of this particular day's devotion was, He Failed the Test. And I was like, okay, Now, really, honestly, that was enough for me because there was no way I'm going to fail the test. Like that, this does not sit right with me. But it said in that particular devotional thought, it says, all should consider what it means to desire heaven and yet to turn away because of the conditions laid down. Think of what it means to say no to Christ. The ruler said, no, I cannot give you all. Do we say the same? And that was enough for me. And I was like, well, I'm not going to tell Jesus no, which I would encourage everybody to do the same. We'll go.
You want to read the second part? All right. So another major issue that we ran up against while trying to prepare for our move was strangely finding housing. We made the 8 to 9 hour drive from Reno to Las Vegas multiple times looking at houses, and each time I had to come with these really long lists. And in Nevada, they do something a little bit different, well, in Las Vegas. And similarly to how you'd have a real estate agent to go look in houses, they have an agent go to rental properties with you. So I would get this long list. I try to contact different rental agents, and every single time there'd be something wrong. Either the house didn't look like it was as clean and pristine on the website, it would be in a bad neighborhood, the place would be trashed, or it'd be taken. And so multiple times, even the week before we were supposed to leave, we drove down there and we were looking at places and everything fell through. But there was one house that actually seemed very plausible. And there was this house in Pahrump. And it had a couple of pools. It was next to a golf course. There were walking paths. And this picture right here looks identical. It's in the same neighborhood as the house. And it was great because it was away from the big city and because we didn't want to live in the middle of Las Vegas. But just as we were about to contact the agent to fill out the application, the district court called David.
Yeah. So when I went there, they wanted me to finalize, take pictures, fingerprints, all this other stuff, because you're working in a court setting. So they want to make sure that you're not some crazy person that they can't trust with other people. So when we went there, one of the things as we were filling it out, they asked, well, have you found a place yet? And I said, yeah, we actually found a place in Pahrump. And when I mentioned that, they're like, Pahrump, it's like, where's that? And then so like, I made sure I specified where it was. It's like, I'm not sure you can do that. And what ended up happening is like, if you're going to work for Clark County, you have to live in Clark County because they don't want funds going into other counties. And so before we could actually take this place, which was like perfectly situated, is about as close to country as you can get when you're near Las Vegas, that immediately just collapsed because there was no way for me to live there and have that. And so now we're back on the scene of having no place to stay because we've already given our notice at our previous place of residence and having no place to stay in the place that I'm supposed to be working, which is a little bit of a problem if y'all can follow. So this is where we found ourselves. So after all this had occurred, I started thinking, I was like, Lord, I want to make sure that I am not calling myself. I want to really make sure that what I'm experiencing is not just me calling myself. And I said this in an exasperated and frustrated way. And I remember I was talking to Jennifer. I was saying, I don't want to find out after all this time I'm the one talking to myself or I'm the one calling myself. And then my phone rang, and guess what was on there? My name and my number. It was like I was calling myself while I was talking to God about this. My phone literally rang and it said David Jones and my number on there. I was actually calling myself, and I'm just like, exactly. This is exactly what I'm talking about. I'm literally calling myself right now. And so God actually, and I think God has a sense of humor. I believe God was doing this because it was his way of letting me know he's listening. Mm-hmm. And by the way, I've never had that happen again since. I don't really even understand how that's possible for that to happen, but lo and behold, I showed her, so I have a witness here that something like this actually had occurred. Mm-hmm. All right.
That was on October 27th, so that was right before we were supposed to be moving. But our time was almost up. Every prospect fell through. Even the situation with the different churches, it didn't come through. It didn't materialize, so we had to just keep going on. And there were so many texts, conversations, sermons that all seemed to reinforce this. I mean, there's so many I couldn't even list it. So we made the decision. We've had enough. We've had enough signs. We've had enough confirmations. We just need to move forward. And so we told the churches, and these are the gifts that they gave us. And I absolutely love the fact that they put an apple in there. I've been helping that for a very long time. So because of the flurry of our obligations that still remain, David had preaching appointments. There were some other meetings that we had. We were scheduled to pack up our stuff and to drive down November 5th and David was going to start work Monday, November 6th. But we ran into some snags.
Yes, so we intended to leave at least maybe sometime in the afternoon, maybe like 2 o'clock in the afternoon. But 2 o'clock in the afternoon turned into 12:30 at night. And if you're doing the math for a 9-hour drive in a U-Haul that you're supposed to drive 55 miles an hour in a 75 mile per hour zone, that means that the time that's estimated is for a car and not for a moving truck. And so we did what any good Christian would do. And we drove 90 miles an hour almost the entire way there.
We donated our stuff.
So once we had packed everything in, the truck was literally packed so tight that we could not fit our kitchen set. And so we actually had to donate our entire kitchen set. It was this really nice dining table and tables and chairs. And so like we had to just get rid of all of that stuff before we left because there's no turning back at this point. And so that became an important point. So as we're driving down this road, going somewhere near the speed limit and towing my car behind me, I'm sitting in the car with the boys and I'm trying to like pass trucks because, they don't like to drive speed limit. And so like, I went to go past one and I saw a truck coming and it was way off in the distance, but somehow that truck seemed to like almost accelerate towards us. And so as I'm trying to pass the truck, this very friendly truck driver decided that he wanted to race me. And it's like, hey, there's a truck coming and I have a car towing behind me. I can't slow down because the amount of distance that there is, I couldn't slow down to get behind him. He's not letting me get in front of him. And U-Hauls don't have a lot of guts, for those of you who have probably learned this before. And so, like, we're sitting here doing this, and I'm like, wow, we're just going to just die on the way to the road. Because, like, now the truck is within, like, 75 feet. There's no way anything is going to happen. And then they just both moved over. Like, the truck next to me moved halfway out of his lane, and the other one moved halfway out of his. And I went perfectly in between with about 2 inches of space on either side of the car and went off. After that, I decided maybe not a good day to pass people on the road. And so that kind of snapped me back into shape. And there were many other such miracles that God did, even on the drive down to Las Vegas.
Yes, and it wasn't more than a few hours before I started having my own issues. So I was in our SUV behind the U-Haul and David's car that was being towed. And I've struggled with insomnia all my life, so I didn't enter into this thing fresh. So for hours, I tried singing as loud as I could, like physically holding my eyes open. And I was at the point, I don't know if anybody else has been there, where like you start hallucinating, you start seeing things jumping on the road. And it's like, oh no, I almost hit a duck in the middle of the desert. But anyways, so I was getting really, really tired. I tried calling David, I tried high beaming him, and nothing seemed to get his attention. Because of where we were at, we had no phone signal. So I was like, oh, I got to do something. This is really bad. But I was at the point where my head was starting to involuntarily like snap back. I would lose control. And as soon as that would happen, it would feel like one of the kids would kick me from behind. And I was so out of it, I didn't even realize the kids were not even in the car with me. They were up in the U-Haul with David, but something kept kicking the back of my chair. And so I wake up and I'm like, okay, I'm awake. But after a little while, I finally lost that battle. And finally, without consent, my body rebelled and I lost the battle. In the fading, distant reality, I heard the car go over the side of the freeway and I lost control. And I slumped over the center console. And all I remember, I still had one hand on the steering wheel. And I felt someone grab the wheel and very quickly redirect it back. Like it was being pulled out of my hand and I popped up. And I was in the middle of the road. And there's nothing, I couldn't have been my own hand, like I was just gone. And later I talked to David about it, and he said he saw the whole thing in the rear view. He saw the car start going off and then jerk back onto the road. So I know God saved our life, even going down to Las Vegas.
Yeah. So following all this, I ended up trying to call her, and she confirmed with me that whole story that you all just heard. So as all these things are going on, time is running out. I have to get there for my job interview. Short story here is I actually had to go and buy clothes for the interview because I'm still wearing the same stuff. I spent all day moving a truck and packing it. And so I wasn't exactly in fashion to fit in with all the people who are wearing suits and ties and lawyers and judges and all that stuff. I look like I did what I just did, which was not sleep that night and move all day. And so
So we parked the U-Haul there very quickly. And as soon as David was out of sight, it was like almost out of nowhere, there was this guy that showed up. And he didn't look very well kept. And he kind of looked like he was suspicious. And he came and he looked in the cars, first around David's car and then around the SUV, and looked right at me. as I'm sitting in the U-Haul with the boys and started like trying to look in there. I was like, okay, this is not where we're leaving our stuff. This is not a very good place. So what I decided to do is it came to my remembrance. We have some friends in ministry, Karen and Wesney White, and they had recommended a church that we visit while we're down there, the Centennial Hills Seventh-day Adventist Church. So at around 7 a.m., I decided I'll call the pastor there. This is not something I would normally do, but this was not a normal situation. I called Pastor Wayne O'Bannon and ask if we could park in the church parking lot. And understandably, he didn't answer at 7 a.m. from a strange number that he had never seen before. So we decided we're just going to go for it anyways.
All right. And so after this, the church was leasing a small building, which you can see here in the picture. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to move along a little bit faster through here. So we were able to park the car there. I started my first day, probably got there at 8:30 when I was supposed to be there at 8, but they were quite understanding. I tried to explain to them as much as what would make sense to any rational human being why we were late, but that was what happened. And so after we got out there, we immediately wanted to hit the ground and find out, why are we in Vegas? And so we went to several different churches.
So this is our first visit to the Centennial Hills Church. And as a disclaimer, the devil on the whiteboard is for the Bible verse that you submit to God and the devil shall flee from you. So anyways, while David was at work, I began looking for hotels. We had to figure something out. And then I discovered that there was a U-Haul facility where, because we had rented a U-Haul, we could get a month free of storage. So we contacted them. We made this arrangement where we would put our stuff in there. David got off of work, and then we drove to the U-Haul facility and began unpacking until about 3 a.m. Because we had to return the truck in the morning. And this is some of these pictures I pulled off of Google Maps, but that's the actual place. I took that picture on the right. So they gave us a large upstairs unit that was probably as far away as possible from the loading deck as you could get. Mm-hmm. And to add to the strangeness of the whole situation, confusing situation, we had made a very unusual friend. Let's see if it'll... So, somebody that we nicknamed the Joker Man. His SUV had spray painted bright green, purple, orange, and it had Joker-themed decals glued to the side of the car. There was a large Batman figurine and Robin that were tied to the top of the car. And on the hood of his car, it said, "The joke's on you." And you could see there were like doll heads hanging from the roof of the inside of his car. He had a life-size clown mannequin in his passenger side seat. And we're like, oh my goodness. And over the next few weeks or so, everywhere we went, this man would be there. We would go to church and he'd be on the side of the road, just parked, and we would pass him. We would go to the skate park and he would show up and park in the parking lot. And we're like, and every time we went to our storage unit, he was there.
Yeah, all night.
All night sometimes. And so we didn't rule out that he could have been a part of the story, but we didn't necessarily extend ourselves at this time either. And as a quick side story, I think it was the first night that we met him, we were unloading our stuff, and all of a sudden, I was keeping a watch on the kids. I hear a scream, and both the kids come running. And I was like, what happened? And so what happened was Josiah thought that the car was a display. So he walked up to the Joker Man's car and was opening all the doors. Starting on the passenger side, then the back side, the next one. But when he opened the driver's side door, the man was in there, hunched over. As soon as he recognized what was going on, he screamed, and he and Judah took off running. Judah later told me he thought that there was a demon in the car. So anyways, I think the Joker Man had just as much to put up with that night as we did.
Yes. Yes. All right. And so just hastening along here, once we got out there, again, we just spent our time trying to figure out whatever we can do to try to reach people. I don't know how many hundreds of tracts that we handed out while we were out there. I remember I got up sometimes at 3 o'clock in the morning trying to pray to figure out why God had us here, handing out tracts everywhere I possibly could, because I really believe that we would need to operate off of this particular principle that if you want to know God's will, if you do the things that you know to do, then you'll know what to do. Or if I can repeat it the way that a friend of ours said, he said, if you do what you know, then you'll know what to do. And so we made sure that whatever we can find to do with our hands, we did.
Yeah, so we ended up trying to visit as many of the 13 Adventist churches in Las Vegas as possible. We tried to hand out tracts wherever we could, and surprisingly, every time we went to a church, they would try to offer us money, and we're like, we're not here for money. We're not trying to scam anybody. We're just trying to figure out what God wants, and we didn't even tell them the whole story, so we refused, and we just move on to another church. So next, I continued house hunting, and I ran into two different issues. One of them, we found a really nice place, and the boys and I went and looked at it while David was at work. And the guy let us in. As soon as he closed the door behind me, I had this weird feeling like, oh my goodness, I just went into an abandoned house with a stranger I don't know, and I brought my kids with me. So the kids took off, and they're looking at all these different things, and I don't feel very comfortable with the situation. So I was like, oh, okay. And I went up and I got the kids. Okay, we got to go. And I talked to him, and he said, well, you know, my license lapsed, and so we have some different procedures than what you would normally do. And he handed me an application, and we were out of there. Later, I talked to a female agent, and when I relayed the story to her, she was like, did the hair on the back of your neck stand up? Because this is a common ploy that people will use to try to commit crimes that I don't want anything to do with. So I feel like God really protected us. And then there was one other house where we were just really like, this is perfect. It has a huge yard. I put in all of the paperwork, and they said nobody else has submitted any applications. But they said, there's one thing that we need is your driver's license pictures. I was okay. So we submitted it, and they called me back and said, I'm sorry, it's no longer available. I'm like, what? They say, yeah, I'm sorry. Well, your husband, he doesn't quite have a job and these different things. I was like, he technically has 3 jobs. He still is employed with 2 places in Nevada or Reno, and he has his specialty court. And I could be a little bit disagreeable sometimes. So I presented all the information, and I'm like, no, this is, we're legit. But the door had just closed, providentially, because God did not want us there. So the next thing, go ahead.
So after all this, I finally got to the place, and this is actually, incidentally, the day that I ended up making this decision is actually 5 years exactly from today. There was when all these things had actually happened, I got to the place where every time I was driving to work, I got lost on my way to work. I would get lost when I parked because the parking garage was about 3 blocks away, and every single building is so tall that you can't see the one you're going to. And so I'd be just wandering around. It was just the most disorganized thing I think I'd ever experienced. But I said to God that day, it's like, Lord, I don't understand the point of this job. I went from being in this really tall building where I can actually interact with people to being in this building that was halfway abandoned, and I had no one that I could actually interact with. And it's like, I can't witness to anybody on this job. And I said, Lord, unless you do something by 12 o'clock today, and I'm not trying to twist God's arm, but I said, unless something happens by 12 o'clock today, I'm not going to stay with this job. I'll stay here in Las Vegas, but I cannot continue to do this kind of work because it's stressing me out. I had bumps breaking out all over my body. I was just in a mess. And so I said, all right, Lord, so unless something happens by this day, I'm taking off. And that day was actually November 12th. Which is 5 years from today. More on that later. So God has a way of making sure that we stay encouraged in continuing to follow him. So I thought perhaps maybe one last thing I can do before I left was to witness to all my coworkers, or my for 1 week coworkers. And so I left books and tracts with everybody that I can think of. I wrote something that was about as heartfelt as I knew how to share with everyone. And literally the moment that I walked out of the building and sat in the car with Jennifer, my phone rang. And so that call was actually from the Nevada-Utah Conference president, who was actually calling me because of the applications that we had submitted up there in Reno for doing like an associate pastor position and some other things there. And I'm like, all right, perfect. I finished my work. This is what God wants us to do. And so he called me and said, hey, I saw your resume. This is interesting to me. I will give you a call back. I have not heard anything back since. Like literally, I've not heard anything back since, even 5 years from that date. And so when all these things happen, it just heightened that confusion. Now, we're going to try to hasten along to finish the last part here, because I know you've been very patient with us as we share our testimony with you here, but God had a plan after all these things. Many applications were submitted to the Washington conference, the Oregon conference as well, because we figured that's eventually where we would go, but we would wait for God's leading.
Yeah, but we also had to start worrying about our finances at this point, because we've been staying in hotels for weeks, for over a week now. So I tried to sell some things in storage. I even tried to sell David's ugly car, but nothing worked. Like nothing worked. Every time someone would reach out and I tried to sell things, it would fall through for one reason or another. So we decided to return to the Cockroach Hotel because they had the best rates. And we knew that God hadn't forsaken us. Although when we got there, we witnessed a 50-something-year-old man stealing towels off the cleaning lady's carts. There was almost a fist fight over somebody's shoes right out the window. But, God protected all of our stuff during this time. Even though sometimes people forget to lock our car door, nothing was ever stolen. So despite the situation and all the strangeness that was going on, none of this seemed to really bother me. I wasn't anxious or bothered or anything. But there was one day I was sitting on this couch, and I was trying not to let my skin touch anything. And I was getting on the boys, don't touch this, don't put your hands near your mouth, don't touch your face, don't put it, getting really anxious about how dirty the place was. And it just really like someone kicked me in the chest. I was like, oh, Lord, what have we come to here? And I felt myself really tempted to just break down and want to just use my own judgment in the situation. And it wasn't more than like 30 seconds that David walked in, and he had found something on the sidewalk outside. And it says, this is a little prayer card. I still keep this in my wallet because it was so meaningful to me. And it says, my Lord God, I have no idea where I'm going. I do not see the road ahead of me. I cannot know for certain where it will end, nor do I really know myself. And the fact that I think that I am following your will does not mean that I am actually doing so. But I believe that the desire to please you does in fact please you. And I hope I have the desire in all that I am doing. I hope that I will never do anything apart from that desire. And I know that if I do this, you will lead me in the right road, though I may know nothing about it. Therefore, I will trust in you always, though I may seem to be lost and in the shadow of death. I will not fear. You are ever with me, and you will never leave me to face my perils alone. And that was encouragement enough for me.
Yeah. So what are the chances of finding that exactly when you need it? So 3 weeks after arriving in Las Vegas, we found ourselves checking into a rundown hotel that was right off the main strip next to a gentleman's club. I don't know why it's called Gentleman. Anyway, this is a picture of it.
Is on the
Yeah,
right
it's on the right, that red building that you could see there on the right.
and the
but
hotel's on the left.
Correct, yes. And so even while we were there, we continued to pray about what should happen next. As I mentioned before, Las Vegas has not been good to my family. And so we had applied to many places, and almost every place that I applied to, most of the conference folks were gone because it was this time of year, because Thanksgiving's coming up, people are taking off vacation, so it's actually really difficult to get in contact with people. We were actually just catching people right before they left. But none of the conferences, whether Oregon, Washington, or Upper Columbia, had any kind of positions that were available. And so when I applied to this conference here about doing any kind of Bible work stuff, they said, well, actually, we just had a position that was filled, but we can keep your application on file. And I said, great.
So that night, things came to a head between David and I. As we mentioned, he had family members that got divorced there. His parents divorced, and there was another family member who almost got divorced. And we had some long-standing disagreements in our marriage. Some of you may be aware of that one issue that you have that just doesn't seem to go away sometimes in your marriage. And all this tension brought it to a head. So that night, I really feel like God shifted things between us. Because where maybe his parents' marriage fell apart, another family's marriage almost fell apart, I feel like God used that situation to make ours stronger. And it was the next morning that we found out that this was a very key part in God's plan.
Yes. So after all this had happened, it was on November 24th, when it was just around checkout time, that I received a call from Tyler Long, who actually is our evangelist in personal ministries and church plant. He still works with our conference here, and he had called me. And so what had happened is that the person who had applied for the Bible work position at this particular church 5 years ago had accepted the position, which some of you all remember this. And then at the last minute, they had to back out of the position. And then when they backed out of the position, it turned out there was only one resume left. Now, incidentally, this is usually how I win at most things in life, is I'm the only one playing the game. And so, nevertheless, the application was there, and it was the only one left. And it just so happened that at the same time, to even add more personal effect, Pastor Long was actually studying for marriage and family therapy, which I happen to have some information about. So we had a really useful conversation. Anybody that's in a job interview, you know that if you connect with the interviewer on something you have in common, the chances of getting that job go way up. So now it's my only application, and we have something in common. And so he's like, hey, we want to interview you on the 30th, or I think it was the 30th.
set a
Oh, he
date
didn't
that
set a
morning.
date. He said, we'd like to interview you maybe in the next week. He said, could you make it down here for an interview? It might be at such and such time in the morning. It's like, oh yeah, we can get there, no problem. Now keep in mind that Las Vegas and Washington are not just 2 hours away. Right? So this was going to be a long drive, but we did not care. As soon as we found out that there was an interview that was moving in the right direction after going in the wrong direction, which sounded exactly like the dream that I'd had earlier, we left. So we packed and we checked out of that hotel at like 2 or 3 p.m. And then we packed until 3 a.m. the next morning because we were leaving. We were done with Vegas. And if we had anything that even sounded like a call that it was time to leave, we were out of there. And so we made our trek up
And
this
as
way.
some final closure as well, while we were packing, the Joker Man showed up. And so we actually had a chance to talk to him, and he was a really nice guy. And I kind of felt bad for,
Calling the police on him.
calling
Yeah.
the police on him and, being very suspicious. And we ended up giving him our fish tank. And he was very appreciative of it. So we even kind of got to close that section off a little bit too. So that's a picture of us packing everything up. And further, we ended up, because we had gotten a smaller truck, but there was a special deal because it was a few inches shorter or a few feet shorter than the normal trucks. We got a special deal on it. So we tried to start packing everything in, and we're just like, oh no, we can't get everything in here. So right here, the U-Haul has a reuse center, and this is the exact spot. We ended up leaving our large couch, and it was the only way we could fit everything in there. And this detail will become important in a little bit. So we packed everything up, and we were on our way to Washington. So on November 25th, the day before Thanksgiving, we stopped in Sacramento to visit with my family, and I am not the kind of person to stay at someone else's house, even if they're family members. But a family member had said, just stay here, and we were in a desperate spot. So I said, okay. And this is actually Judah sleeping on the floor on an air mattress on their floor. But it turned out to be a tremendous blessing because this family member had had some really ridiculous experiences in the church and with church people. And when I became a Christian, I wasn't always very tactful. I was probably a little too zealous at times. But we had this really good conversation that ranged from my personal testimony and how God reached my heart all the way to what happens when you die. And I feel like that created a really good connection that would not have happened otherwise. And so I was very thankful for this. And I thought to myself, if this was the only reason that God led us through here, it would be worth it to me. So anyways, we ended up having that conversation, and the trip resulted in a lasting good impression. So during this whole trial, we had several friends checking in on us. Among those were the Vega family, who they're here today, Chris and Shannon, and they had recently moved from Reno to Olympia, the ones that we had visited back in April. So they insisted that we stay at their house, and I'm glad that they did. That was really, we probably wouldn't have done that. It was hard enough staying at a family member's house, let alone, people that we didn't have years and years and years of, anyways. So we stayed at their house, which was roughly, at that time, 1,000 square foot. We crammed 4 adults, 5 boys, 2 cats, 1 dog, and 1 bathroom, and we stayed on 1 couch. The situation was not ideal for any of us, but they welcomed us in, they treated us like family, and I know if it meant staying there longer term, they would have done it. And that really meant a lot. It really meant a lot to us. And since then, we've kind of joked that maybe God wasn't calling us to Las Vegas, but to the Vegas.
Yes. Yes. Incidentally spelled the same way, right?
So now we waited to see what God was going to do with this whole interview situation. This time was particularly difficult because while we were on someone else's couch, we also found out that it could take up to a year for David to get his license so he could start working. And if he's not working, we can't rent anywhere. And we don't want to spend a year on these poor people's couch who so nicely extended themselves.
Right. So just a few days into our stay with the Vegas, I actually interviewed with Pastor Bartolome. All of this actually happened on November 30th, which incidentally was my birthday, when I'd interviewed with him. And the short of it is that we ended up taking the position here. And then shortly, I think it was probably about 3 weeks later, my license actually came through so that I could actually work here in the state of Washington, because, there's not a lot of reciprocity between states, but Washington just so happens to have what's called an agency affiliated certification that allows you to work if you're licensed within the state of Washington, because the agency can be your license for you. And so that happened to work out quite well for us as well.
So after 1 week on the Vegas couch, on December 4th, a housing opportunity opened up. Pastor Ira texted David a picture of a little house in the woods that some church members were renting. And I believe it's only the Spirit of God that caused rational, intelligent human beings to rent to a family with a very strange story, with no job and no credibility. But God opened up the door. So it's also interesting, when we walked into this little house, do you guys remember the furniture items we left along the way? We walked in there, they had a couch and a dining room table with all the chairs already in there. And looking at it, it's like none of our stuff would have fit in there. Our table was huge, our big couch was huge, and God saved us that little extra trouble along the way when we had to move all of our stuff. And we're just like, God knew this story from the beginning, and he took care of us. Also, on December 16th, December 18th, the Centralia Church Board approved the Bible work position, and David was going to start on January 1st.
Yeah. So as I mentioned already, I was able to get my temporary license, and we'll just kind of jump ahead.
So on December 1st, we walked into the Centralia Church during the Thunder in the Holy Land series, looking beat down by trials, looking haggard and crazy, but we were incredibly blessed by all that God had done. And this really became a source of comfort and encouragement sometimes when you get discouraged along the way. But God had his hand in it the whole time.
So there was several things that had occurred afterwards when I was talking about, when I recalled my prayer about wanting to be led the way that Abraham was. One of the things I mentioned is I wanted to be as certain about our move here as I was with our marriage. And we actually had to pack up our things, guess how many times? It was 6 times, exactly like what happened before we got married. Now, you can't make this stuff up, nor can you make this stuff happen. It also turned out that we actually, just like with Abraham actually had to travel down to Egypt before he ended up coming back up to the Promised Land, which I thought was also fascinating. And like every piece of what was asked for was fulfilled. When we also looked a little bit further, we thought back on the lots.
So you remember how we cast lots, and it was more of a source of frustration than anything else? How the boys had, myself and the boys, we had all pulled Las Vegas, and David pulled Olympia. You see those arrows there? We spent 3 weeks in Las Vegas and 1 in Olympia, just like the lots, just like the lot results.
So I really want to submit to you that if somebody was looking at this from the outside, it just sounds like an ordinary move. People pack up and move all the time. But when you are trying to listen for the voice of God, even ordinary things come out in extraordinary ways. Things like this build and increase our faith, and they actually let us know that we can trust God's leading. In fact, go back one. Yeah, there we go. The last thing that I was able to read, I don't know if it'll show there. Maybe try to advance one more time. Okay, there we go. Was actually this statement here. And I actually put it in red. The rest of it is also very interesting, but I'm just going to read in red. This was talking about Peter when he was led out onto the water with Jesus. It said in the red there, it says, Jesus did not bid Peter to come to him that he should perish. He does not call us to follow him and then forsake us. And that was the last word that I read before we actually made our way out in this direction. And I have found that God is 100% faithful. But we also, again, want to make sure that if we are claiming to listen to the voice of God, that you find every evidence in the world that supports what it is that we say that God is speaking to us. And so we pray that that encourages you, that God is still in the business of speaking to us. And we have no idea what God is going to do from here. But we know that whatever God is calling us to do, we can trust his voice, and we encourage you to do the same. That last statement says there in the green, it says, day by day, God instructs his children. By the circumstances of daily life, he is preparing them to act their part upon a wider stage to which his providence has appointed them. It is the issue of the daily test that determines their victory over life's great crisis. And so I pray that today You don't have to wait for some big dream or some big event, but make sure that you are listening to God all day long, every day, because he is constantly preparing you for something much greater. And with that, let's go ahead and have a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, I know that there was much to share and there was much more besides, but I pray that, Lord, for every person that was willing to come and to listen to these things, Lord, that they would also be able to listen closely to how your voice is speaking to them. Lord, may they seek the greatest of evidences, Lord, that you are by their side, but may they also be willing to follow you, even if it seems that you are leading in unpleasant paths. Lord, I pray that they would trust you all the way and they would know that anywhere with Jesus is better than any place that we can choose for ourselves. And we just pray for your continued guidance and leading, and we pray that you would bless this congregation, Lord, as we part past at this moment. And we ask for this in the name of Jesus. Amen.
Amen.